How's it going, everybody? Back again this week for another tier list video. Want to give a shout out to everybody over at playingpioneer.com. If you've been checking out their website, the decks page includes a written version with deck lists of all of these tier lists. Moving forward, every Tuesday, you should be able to find the written version of the tier list up there, potentially with some changes as it involves some other people and us discussing it out. But the video version with the in-depth details will still be up here on my channel every Wednesday. So, we've seen the Luris bans kick into effect. We've had a full challenge now with Luris gone. So let's take a look at what has shaken out as we move back to using all 5 tiers here. First up, we're going to start in D tier. Once again, these are decks that I don't think are well positioned in the meta. I think they may have had 1 or 2 reasonable finishes, usually top 16ing a challenge, but in the long run, I don't think these are decks you want to pick up for this week, especially not for SCG Con Indy. So first up in D tier, we have Mono Black Aggro. This is a deck that used to run the streets back when Smuggler's Copter was around, but since the Luris bans, it started to see some play again, trying to attack decks that want to use their hand aggressively. Things like spell-based combo of Lotus Field, Jeskai Ascendancy, or Blue-White Control. But I think in the long run, Mono Black Aggro is a deck that still needs to use the battlefield to close out games, and their recursive engines aren't as powerful as they used to be, between copies of Portable Hole, Farewell, and other exile effects that stop your recursion much more regularly than they used to. March of the Otherworldly Light is another big reason that even though one of your better matchups in theory is Blue-White Control, it doesn't necessarily play out that way in the games. Next up we have Jund's Sacrifice, another one of those decks that has been the best deck in the format at points, but I think right now you're not really attacking any part of the meta very well. You can still steal wins, there's various versions, there's the Corvold heavy versions, the Citadel heavy versions, or the Carn versions, but I think in reality, Jund's Sacrifice is missing a few pieces to be able to fight on the same axis as some of the better decks. That's more to say that the power level of the other decks has gone up, but hopefully with the next set coming out and having Jund as a color share, maybe we'll get some new tools. Next up we have Esper Greasfang, a deck that I know has a lot of fans. I think this deck continues to struggle in the face of interaction with the graveyard, as well as being able to kill Greasefangs. I think that while there are good results with Esper Greasfang, I still think that Abzan Greasefang is likely the better place to be, but I think until we see a downtick in decks like Winota, Niv to Light, and even Mono Red Aggro and Blue-White Control, I don't know if Greasefang is the card you want to be leaning on. Last up in D tier, we have Red-Black Sacrifice. We saw a Red-Black Sacrifice deck top 16 a challenge, and while losing Luris clearly showed a problem for the deck moving forward, this was a proof of concept to show that we can still have the Red-Black Unequaled Anvil decks. I think these decks will move towards Sorin the Mirthless and other ways to continue their card advantage now that they no longer have to be restricted by the Luris companion. However, I think this deck still needs to develop. I think it's a proof of concept, but now I want to see it refined before I'm willing to move it up the tiers at all. Next up we have C tier, starting off with Mono Blue Spirits, a deck that continues to rise little by little, but I think overall Mono Blue Spirits right now has a good shot of being able to sneak in some good placings. It showed up well in the challenges this week, mainly taking care of Blue-White Control and other spell-based mid-range decks, where you can sneak 1 or 2 threats onto the battlefield and then just protect them, sort of following that old Delver style. Next up we have 5-Color Humans, a deck that I think is just missing a piece or two. It's not quite there in my opinion. I think it has great weekends when people aren't necessarily respecting it, but I think having a bad Winota matchup is a death knell right now. I think the Winota matchup is like playing a mirror, except they have a combo and you don't. I think if you had Champion of the Parish, if you had Avacyn's Pilgrim, or if you had more tax effects, things like Meddling Mage, you'd be able to reasonably take this deck to the next level. For right now, I think this deck is comfortably in C tier. It could oscillate up or down, but until Winota, Blue-Red, and Niv alongside blue-white control see less meta share, I can't see humans really taking off. Finally, for C tier, we have Bant Spirits, and the same guys as Mono Blue Spirits. I think that Bant Spirits is very good at punishing some of these mid-range decks by getting under them. I think having interaction for Supreme Verdict is very important out of Bant Spirits in Spellcaller, and I think that you have better catch-up mechanics through Collected Company than decks like Mono Blue Spirits do, but I think both Spirits decks have a good time facing against these control decks that were piling up last week. I think as these control decks start to fall away, they're going to leave Bant Spirits in a worse and worse spot, especially if decks like Mono Red Aggro pick back up. Next up, we're on to B tier. These are decks that I wouldn't be shocked to see putting up reasonable finishes, including top 8s in the challenges. I think these are decks you need to respect, but necessarily if you are going to pick a deck with all the confidence in the world for an event, these are probably just below the picks I would recommend. Finally, sneaking down out of A tier is Mono Green Carn. I think this deck is still phenomenal. I think it still does some really powerful things, but a lot of its best matchups got hit by the Lotus ban. I think that Mono Green Carn really preyed on decks that couldn't go over the top of it, and between Winota getting under it quickly, Blue-Red being able to interact with it favorably in a long game, Niv, Lotus Field, Mono Red Aggro, Blue-White Control, I think all of these are matchups that are a lot closer than the Luris matchups were for Carn. I think we're going to see the meta share of Mono Green Carn start to slowly dwindle, and for right now, I don't think it's in the best place. However, I think if you can get an early Old Girls Troll into a Cavalier of Thorns, you are spectacularly favored against some of the low-to-the-ground aggressive decks. Next up, we have Red-White Burn, a return to form of one of the oldest decks in Pioneer. Even with the Luris Burn, this deck put up a solid finish this week with a 3rd place finish on Sunday's challenge. I think we are seeing the return to linear aggro low-to-the-ground burn decks because you can win outside of combat, and you can heavily punish some of the slower decks like Blue-White Control. I think if Blue-White Control continues to fall down the ranks, these decks will be the reason, and you'll see some of the spell-based combo decks start to have to respect them again. This is the cycle of Pioneer. You're going to keep seeing it over and over again, even without Luris. Once we get to a point where control is ubiquitous, these burn decks, these low-to-the-ground aggro decks will push it out, and then the mid-range decks will push those out, and we continue the cycle onward. Next up is that next iteration of that cycle in red-black mid-range. I think this is a deck that will struggle if you lose the matchup lottery with hitting things like Blue-White Control or Blue-Red Phoenix without hitting your graveyard interaction. However, I think if you run into the burn decks, the mono-red aggro decks, you have a great shot. The other thing that red-black mid-range really fears is a resurgence of Nivtalite, which did win a challenge this last weekend because you have so many difficulties overcoming a single Niv Mizzet. So if we see a continued rise of Niv, mid-range falls back a little. If we see the rise of these aggro decks, black-red mid-range moves up. Finally, in B tier, we have Blue-White Control falling down from its S tier position very recently. I think, unfortunately, the week of the Luris bans, you saw a lot of people trying to innovate with a little bit clunkier builds. Blue-White Control still very good into those, but as decks start to refine, as we get into the more strictly aggressive linear meta, Blue-White Control will struggle. You don't have enough interaction that is meaningful. You don't have enough counterspells that can actually stop things early, and you are relying on Supreme Verdict, which is not a very good answer when the chip damage is already done. Next up, we have A tier. These are decks that I think are very well positioned, likely contenders to win the challenges, and also good choices moving into the weekend for, say, SCG Indy. First up, I mentioned it before, Nivtalite. I think this deck continues to rise. It has good matchups into the linear aggro decks, especially if you're able to customize your builds. And I think you have that freedom to sort of choose what you want to lose to with this kind of deck. You have a lot of good toolbox tools against the combo decks, especially with Unmoored Ego, Slaughter Games, etc. And I think that overall, Niv is on a good trajectory. However, I think that it will still struggle into some of the matchups like Lotus Field and Winota that are still hanging around to punish these mid-range style decks. Speaking of, next up is Lotus Field, a deck that again will struggle against some of these linear aggro decks, but as decks slow down to take out these aggro decks, Lotus Field continues to pick up ground. You want to run into decks like Mono Green Carn, Red Black Midrange, Nivtalite. You want to find these decks that are targeting the aggro decks, and even against the aggro decks, if you have Grazer starts, you can still win quickly. I think Lotus Field continues to be in great shape and continues to sneakily put up very good results each weekend. I think it will take a even more defined aggressive meta to really push Lotus Field back out, or to switch to a point where people are playing enough control because the mid-range decks have taken over. Next up, we have Mono Red Aggro. A real surprise to me, but this deck put up monstrous results on Sunday. Putting 3 decks in the top 16, including 2 in top 8. This is the kind of deck that can punish the resurgence of blue-white control, that can beat up on some of these clunkier mid-range decks, that can punish these tempo-based decks like Spirits. And I think that Mono Red Aggro, especially leveraging the new 1-mana Saga from Kamigawa, is in a great position to try and get under most decks. However, decks like Mono Red Aggro will always struggle into decks like Niv to Light, Winota, and Blue-Red, and I think that even though this deck put up some great finishes alongside Red-White Burn, I think until decks like Blue-Red and Winota fall out of the meta or are hated out of the meta, there is a hard cap to how good these linear aggro decks can be. Finally, we have S tier. These are the decks that I would easily expect to dominate the field. If you had to give me one choice, I think these are the best choices for SCG Con Indy, and they're no surprise. It is Blue-Red Phoenix, the perpetual top deck of Pioneer in my opinion, putting up a win on Sunday's challenge as well as multiple top 8s and top 16s. Blue-Red Phoenix continues to dominate linear aggro, continues to be able to play long to mid-range, long games against mid-range and interact with control. You have so many different axes you can attack on, and I think that if you play this deck to its highest limits, there is very little that can punish you right now in Pioneer. Finally, our last S tier deck is Winota, still coming up clutch, coming in second in both challenges this weekend, putting up good results. If you see linear aggro, if you see mid-range, if you see decks that don't want to interact, Winota is just usually a step faster. You go over the top. And while there are plenty of ways to interact with Winota, in the end, I think you need Winota to fail more so than you can beat it in a lot of matchups. I think Blue-Red is still the only thing keeping Winota down, and I think that those two decks are in a race right now to see who will claim the spot as the best Pioneer deck post-Luris. I think they are a full notch ahead of the rest of the field, and I think if you are trying to win an event this weekend and you are not on Blue-Red or Winota, you have to justify a reason to be that way. With that said, to all of you going to SCG Con Indy, please stay safe. I wish you the best of luck. Let me know in the comments down below what you're running, or what you would be running if you were going, and what decks you think deserve to be in different places on this tier list. Until next time, thanks. Hey there. Thanks for stopping by. I hope you've enjoyed this content on either Twitch or YouTube. If you did, please like or subscribe. If you didn't, be sure to leave a comment down below. I promise not to read it. Until next time.